Decisive Decade, American Grand Strategy for Triumph over China, written by Dr. Jonathan D.T. Ward. I was kindly given a copy of this book to review for free by his PR and publicity staff, so thank you very much to them for gifting me this book. So yeah, I received this, I think I received it in March or April, but I've been very busy, so it's May, potentially June when you're seeing this review. And in this podcast, I'm actually only going to be reviewing the second half of the book. So the book is in like 4 sections, so I'm going to be reviewing the last 2 sections, but I've already reviewed the first 2 sections over on Substack. So if you want to read and sort of know my full take on the book, you can head over to my Substack and read about the first 2 sections there. But yeah, today I just wanted to give my thoughts on this book overall, as well as sort of what I think of Ward's strategy, so to speak, for US victory over China, and just some of my feelings on what the book does well, where it falls short, and things like that. I'd be quite interested to do more book reviews actually on this podcast, as you know, there are books coming out all the time about China, so it's actually it's something that we can do together to kind of keep ourselves up to date with the literature. This is a little bit different for me because this is more of like a political science book, whereas in my own time I would usually read things like social sciences, history, or anthropology, sociology, that kind of stuff. So like humanities and more social side of things, whereas this is more like current affairs, geopolitics. I know in the previous podcast episode about Peter Zeihan, I was saying that I don't want to nitpick people's work anymore, and I try really hard not to do that in this book, but I think overall my review isn't entirely favourable, and I'll try and explain why as I go through. But I had a really hard time coming up with sort of like my overall rating for the book, if that made sense. Like if I was to give it a rating out of 5, would it be 2.5? Would it be 3? I'm not sure, but let's talk about it and I'll let you guys know what my thoughts are. So first of all, I think it'd be good to give you kind of like a background to the book and the author. So this is the description that I've just taken from his website and also from Amazon, where you can buy a copy of the book. So Dr. Ward has been studying US-China relations for nearly 20 years since his undergraduate days at Columbia. He's a speaker and a pundit, as well as the founder of the Atlas Organization, a DC-based consultancy focused on US-China global competition. In the Decisive Decade, Ward offers a comprehensive framework for how the United States can and must defeat China on the world stage economically, diplomatically, militarily, and ideologically. With expert analysis on the history of US-China relations, as well as insight into how the Russia-Ukrainian war can inform a strategic thinking, the Decisive Decade presents a unique toolkit for our triumph over China. Dr. Ward is also the author of China's Vision of Victory, a guide to the global grand strategy of the Chinese government, which has been widely read by the US government and national security circles, as well as by numerous audiences in business and finance. So this is his second book, as far as I can tell. The first one came out in 2019, I believe, so not that long between the 2 books. The first book was much more focused on kind of China's vision, so to speak. So it's kind of like written from China's perspective about how they want to go about taking over the global stage, so to speak, replacing America in that way. And then this book is kind of like the response to that. So what should the US's response to China's strategy be? Just some context about the audience that the book is written for is quite important. So in the kind of who is this to section, he says, "To my fellow Americans, may you come to see your importance to the world." So it's very much written for that general audience. Also, as it says here, for like high-level political thinkers, strategists, either in the military field or political field, who have to sort of come up with how America is going to go about its international plans and global governance role, so to speak. It's kind of semi-academic, I would say, not necessarily in my wheelhouse. I think personally I just have a little bit of an issue with books that are written for general audiences, because they tend to be quite light on sort of factual details. They tend to gloss over a lot of stuff. But I was pleasantly surprised with this book that he actually gave a lot of detail and tended to explain concepts, ideas, history really, really well. So like the history, say, of the Cold War, the context of China's relationship with China, how the Chinese Communist Party thinks. I would say this author has a very good understanding of China, what the CCP's overall goals are, where they're going, what they see of themselves for the future. He references things like the Belt and Road, and he talks about that in detail. He talks about China's 2049 plans. I think he tends towards the Machiavellian a little bit too much. I think he kind of overthinks a little bit what China's overall goals are, and it comes across very much like China is trying to destroy the US and take over the world. And it's like, I think there's a little bit of that, but I think it's kind of taken to the extreme in this book, if that makes sense. It's not that he's wrong. I think he's just taking these thoughts and these things that are basically true to kind of like the logical extreme. But I suppose, again, if you're coming up with a strategy, formulating a strategy, it's not wrong to think that China sees the US as their direct enemy. I think that is true. So taking that as a base, I don't think the book is wrong in how it frames China's goals and ambitions. I was struggling to find like an adjective to describe the book overall in terms of like, is it written in an aggressive tone? Is it written in an open-minded way? I think the adjective that I settled on is American, especially if you're not from the US, if you're a European especially. It's written in that very American way. It's very patriotic in a way that we perhaps wouldn't be quite used to. It's not necessarily that he speaks about America very positively. It's more that he is very assured in America's capability to enact all of the strategic plans that he comes up with, if that makes sense. So he'll say something like, from the first section about economics, for example, he'll say like, we need to pull American businesses out of China, stop using Chinese supply chains, set up new supply chains with developing regions and other democracies, rebuild America's industrial base. And he says it all with a very assured tone, if you will. So he's very confident that the US is able to, I suppose not reclaim, because he believes that the US is still sort of like the foremost superpower in the world, but sort of retain and strengthen its position as the dominant superpower, and as well as shutting China out. And that's a very important part of his strategy as well. At least he's very honest about China's capabilities and China's plans and the potential for China to replace the US. The book is almost a warning, if you will, to people who might be watching or people who are interested in China's relationship with the US and the world. Unlike someone like Peter Zeihan, who's like, China's on the decline and we don't really need to do anything about it, Ward has very much a warning tone in this book where it's like, China is coming for us, and unless we do something very actively, we will be replaced, so we need to take action now. And then he kind of lays out his strategy in these four main arenas, which are economics, diplomacy, military, and ideas is sort of the last section. Something that I didn't like in general about the book, I want to get this bit out of the way because I feel like this is nitpicking. It might just be a personal preference, but he uses very, very long quotes in the book, and lots of them as well. So when I say a long quote, if you've got like 2 pages, for example, about one whole page is a quote. So for those of you who are looking visually, it's kind of like the bottom third of one page, and then 3/4 of the next page is all one big quote. And this might be the teacher coming out in me, but I really dislike it if a quote is more than 5 lines. Like, I'm not reading it. If you can't put it into your own words, then you don't need to include it, is my take on it. You know, in some cases he's quoting himself and speeches that he's given, but a lot of the time he's quoting sort of recent speeches given by like Barack Obama or Biden or some like high up financial guy, and I feel like it would have been better in some cases to just summarize what they had said, or if you're using their idea, just reformulate the idea and put in a footnote, as opposed to using like, you know, a 20-line paragraph. Because I don't know about you guys, but my eyes just like skip over that. But that just might be like from when I was doing my PhD and I got really lazy and I never used to read long quotes, and I just used to like try to get the gist more than anything else. So that's the context and the background of the book, that's the overall goal of the book, and that's my little nitpicky comment. So, like I said, I'm going to cover the last 2 sections in this review, and they are in the military arena and the arena of ideas. His strategy for the US to defeat China in the military arena, the foundation of the strategy is to avoid war with China. As he said, he says, the essence of US grand strategy must be to decisively win the economic arena while also blocking the path for a war initiated by the Chinese Communist Party. You know, as an idea, as a base, I think that's a really, really good idea. I think it's in everyone's best interest to avoid war, but particularly the US. I think the amount that their economy is struggling at the moment, that would really put the nail in the coffin, potentially, for the US if they went to war with China, and it would be very unpopular. I think certain people in the US think that a war with China would be popular because China isn't so popular, but I don't think a war in general, especially not one where the US is the main party, would be popular. You know, something like the Ukrainian war is a little bit detached. You know, while the US is, as we recently discovered, covertly sending troops over there, or is like helping the Ukraine through third-party bodies like NATO, they can still have that kind of detached involvement. But I think an actual direct conflict, especially one, I feel like something with China would be particularly drawn out. I don't think that would be a very good idea. However, I immediately then start disagreeing with everything that he said. For example, he seems to promote this idea, he uses this phrase, American peace or Pax Americana, quite a few times. And he says things like, though some may dispute it, the American tradition is not only peace through strength, but also an emphasis on peace itself. Ours is not a nation that usually aims to cast the first blow, even when obvious dangers loom. I'm pretty sure this author is older than me, so the fact that, you know, like Iraq and Afghanistan just simply don't exist in the sort of ideology of this book is very interesting to me. The idea that the US is a nation that never invades, never aggresses, you know, has always tried to maintain peace and keep the peace. It's just, that's a very interesting idea to me. It's not really something that I could personally get my head around. Maybe I'm not on the same page as him, but I don't see that for the US. I don't see them as like this loving peacekeeping nation necessarily. Also, he says, we hope that our engagement would create a responsible stakeholder out of one of the most deadly and dangerous regimes in global history. Having been fooled, and having fooled ourselves about those dangerous intentions, we have no choice left but to change our approach to this contender. As we must, we shall build our best defense and prepare to defend our world and our way against the People's Republic of China. The US did not engage with China because they were trying to create a responsible stakeholder. That's not the reason they engaged with China, is because of the cheap manufacturing. They had hoped that as a byproduct of China's integration into the global economic system, things like the World Trade Organization in the early noughties, that China would open up more economically. However, the US continued to increase its engagement with China even after it became apparent that China was not going to change its political system or become a responsible stakeholder, or whatever phrasing you want to use. I don't like it when people use language that makes it seem like America's being picked on, or, you know, America was in the right and someone else was in the wrong and is taking advantage of the US. He's got another line that's like, we should also remember that the US was the original enemy in Chinese Communist Party thinking at the founding of the People's Republic of China. Chinese leaders continue to view us this way despite an era of US engagement. The reverse could exactly be said about the US. The US has demonized communism since it, you know, came out in Russia in the early 20th century, and has continued to demonize communism with the Red Scare, worked very hard to make sure that European countries didn't go communist, and, you know, like, shut off economically and politically lots of countries that did. It's positioning the US as like, oh, well, we tried and we were very reasonable, when that's actually not the case. You know, both sides are at fault here. It's positioning the US as kind of like the responsible global leader, and China is this kind of like bolshy, butting in, bull in a china shop kind of actor that I don't think is very accurate. And it's very glossy and from a US perspective through that rose-tinted lens of like, remember when we saved the world in the Second World War, and remember when we led the West to victory during the Cold War. It's very that kind of tone. I don't have a problem with the framing of the book as being pro-US, because obviously that's the aim of the book, but I don't like it being used to kind of gloss over the US's actual role and actual actions in the global community. Something else, again, going back to the idea of exaggerating what China has done, he says that China and Russia are military partners. That's factually not true. I understand why he said it, because, you know, he's trying to create a strategic plan, right? So he's saying that basically there is a potential for China and Russia to collaborate militarily because they are so close politically, and they are the closest allies on that side of the political spectrum. And also because the US is used to having military bases abroad, like in Asia, East Asia and Southeast Asia, and allies in Europe, things like NATO, that are military partners. But I feel like it's a false equivalency to an extent. I don't think it's necessarily a given that China or Russia would come to the other's aid in a military conflict. In fact, we've seen actually that it's not the case. In the case of the Ukraine, China has not come to help Russia at all. I know they're not the party being invaded, but, you know, NATO as a proxy of the US has come to the the Ukraine's aid. So it's not a one-to-one comparison in that respect. So I think that's just something that needs to be like pointed out, because again, he's taking everything to kind of like the logical extreme, like, oh, maybe China and Russia will fight together, but we haven't seen any actual evidence of that yet. And I think that's quite important. Even in the Cold War, we didn't see that, or before that. So yeah, that's something I think that's important to bear in mind. So he does have some actual strategy in this section, which I think is good, because when I talked about the first two sections in my blog post, I mentioned the fact that, especially the economic part, there wasn't really that much actual tangible strategy. The diplomacy part was a bit better. The military part is middling. It's okay. So this is kind of what he wants from the strategy: to deter Chinese military aggression, roll back Chinese influence in developing countries, and rebuild deterrence forces in the Asia Pacific. Focus on the 4 key arenas of maritime, cyber, space, and nuclear. Defend Taiwan, South and East China Seas and the Himalayas, but generally deter China everywhere. And focus on the preponderance of US power, so making sure that the US has presence all around, but particularly in democratic countries. I said this about my review of the first section as well, but I feel like non-democratic countries, or countries that aren't perfectly aligned with the US's vision of the world, often get left out, even though they may want to ally with the US but have no choice to ally with China for, like, say, economic reasons. So I think his strategy is kind of missing out that key detail of like the more active engagement of countries that may be dithering between the two sides. I think that because the book is generalist, so I'm, answering it in a sort of a generous sort of way, but surely if the US is looking to be a global leader, sidelining 50% of the countries around the world just because they're not democratic or they're not politically aligned with the US, or because they might have certain deals with China, I don't think is necessarily the best strategy. I think you're leaving a lot on the table there. And in general, it kind of goes back to, again, another problem I had with the first section, where a lot of countries are kind of seen as almost pieces on a chessboard. I think he actually uses that phrase at one point in the diplomacy section. He calls it like our global chessboard, emphasis on the our. Although I find that he is quite realistic despite his nationalism. He's very realistic about like China's capabilities, what the US is lacking, or areas for improvement. I don't know, he still kind of sees it as like, well, America will lead and everyone else will follow, and that's just the way it is. So it's a little bit dismissive in that area, and I think that's sort of what I have a problem with his military section, but I think the actual strategy part of that is a little bit stronger here. Moving on to the last section, which is part 4, the arena of ideas. In every aspect, I found this section of the book to be the weakest. He tends to put like a little quote. I don't know why I'm holding the book up because you can't see, but he tends to have a little quote at the beginning of each section. And earlier sections have had quotes by Winston Churchill or Theodore Roosevelt, people like that. The quote from this section is from Twitter, and the quote itself is, "Be the America that Hong Kong thinks you are." And the quote is attributed to Twitter, so not even a user, just like Twitter in general. And just, yeah, I think that sets up this section in the way that it continues, which is relatively weak. For example, he has a quote on page 205. "Once in China, I was told that dynasties fall when there is a threat from outside and a threat from inside, when these two threats come at once. My time in China taught me the enormous scale of what America will face in international affairs. My time in America has shown me that despite our enormous potential, we live today as a wounded nation." So I was like, okay, great. He talks about like the divisions within American society. He talks about how China is quite strong on patriotism and how America is quite weak in terms of its social cohesion at the moment. So I was really interested to see where he was going to go with that. Which divisions specifically was he going to talk about? How exactly America could rebuild that social cohesion, bring people back together, rebuild the idea of like the American dream, so to speak, and come together to understand that the main adversary is not internal, but actually external. It's China. And I was very disappointed to see that he didn't do any of that, essentially. The basic message of this section is just that America has to be more America everywhere. Basically, yeah. He talks vaguely about the American idea, the founding principle, the Bill of Rights, all of those sorts of key American tropes that everyone has heard of, that always turn up in American media, in speeches by US leaders, but nothing of substance. I find like at one point he even quotes all the amendments to the Constitution. He sort of lists out the 10 amendments. Is it the Constitution or the Bill of Rights? Sorry, I'm not sure what the difference is. Apologies to my American listeners. You know, he lists them out again in a really long quote that I really dislike, but I don't see what that adds. I don't see what naming one by one without explaining them, without expanding on them, without explaining how that differentiates the US from China and how that can be used to build a better society. He doesn't go into any of that. So I found this section overall to be really weak. He says, we have the values of liberty, human rights, self-government, and the rule of law, the consent to be governed, and of free economies, free inquiry, and free enterprise. It goes on like that, just listing things that America has, listing things that China is kind of negative on, you know, like issues with Tibet, Xinjiang, things like that. But this is sort of common knowledge, and I know that this book might be aimed at a general audience, but you're only going to read this book if you're interested in China in the first place. So these are things that you're already going to know, like the basic differences in principles and ideas and governance between China and the US. So simply restating that for me was like a waste of a chapter, basically. So it wasn't very satisfying from that perspective. So my final thoughts on this book. It's described on the back cover as a rousing playbook for American victory against China. Rousing isn't necessarily the word I would use. I think a better R word would be repetitive. Themes, even phrases, are repeated throughout the book. I found it lacking in depth. I thought the historical parts were very strong. The parts where he talked about China and sort of discussed China's ideas, I suppose he's written a book on that before, so he's got a very good understanding of that aspect of China. Those bits were the strongest parts. Anything where it had to be sort of forward-looking, forward-thinking, actually coming up with a detailed strategy for how the US was going to go from A to Z just was not there for me. Even things like costs, you know, how much is it actually going to cost to rebuild the military? How much investment? Just saying that the government has to invest is not a strategy to me. Like, that's prima facie, or whatever they say, a priori, however you want to put it. It's obvious, you know, of course you would do that first. And then I found the tone of the book to be a little bit contradictory, because on the one hand he argues, you know, like the US is the free world, and over here we can do whatever we want, our businesses, our people can do whatever they want. At the same time, we have to abandon all those principles of freedom. American companies have to pull out of China. We all have to huddle together and, you know, regroup and stop engaging with China altogether, and everyone has to focus on the US now and only do what's best for the US. You can't do what's in your best interest because we absolutely have to win. It's not necessarily a contradiction, but there were elements of the book that I felt were almost jealous of what China is able to achieve, because he points out that, you know, China is able to get all of its businesses to focus on achieving what the Chinese Communist Party wants to achieve, and the business community and the military community are really well integrated, and they all do what the government says. So in some respects he seemed almost jealous of what the Chinese Communist Party was able to achieve, and the US was sort of lacking in that regard. There were two kind of areas that I thought were like missing for me. So the first was a definition of what it actually means to win. And, you know, what happens to China in the aftermath? It's supposed to be the decisive decade, but it would have been nice to hear what he thought the actual result of this engagement between China and the US would be. Would China's economy collapse? Would it just stagnate? You know, the CCP isn't going to sit down and just take whatever the US does to it. So how might China respond? Perhaps that's the question for the next book, but that was certainly left sort of hanging. This is very much sort of a contained strategy. It doesn't go anywhere beyond that, and I'm kind of curious about what the author actually thinks about that. And then I guess a broader question is, for me, I don't really understand. He doesn't really make a case for why it has to be the US that is the one to defeat China. It's very much the US has been the world leader for the past 100 years, and so it should continue to be so for the next 100 years. To me, that's not an argument. That's a wish. You know, you're listing out things that you would like to happen, which isn't the same thing as having an actual reason why the US should be the global leader. It would have been nice if Rome had continued for another 1,000 years, but that's not what happened, right? And then the clinging on to the idea of Rome led to its gradual and sort of awkward decline and the things like the Byzantine Empire. So we don't want that for the US. If you're going to take the global stage, I think there has to be a reason, and I think you have to know that reason in order to convince everyone else who you want to follow along with your plan to go along with. So I think leaving that hanging for me also contributes to the lack of depth of this book. Final thoughts. The back cover says that it's $28.99 US, 37 Canadian for the hardcover, or around $18 US for the ebook. I wouldn't buy it. Sorry, that sounds really harsh. It's not that I would tell you not to buy it. It's not for me. If you're into political science, strategic thinking, if that's your favorite genre or something that you're interested in, definitely interesting. However, for me, the lack of depth and the sort of questions that are left hanging for me just left it a little bit much to be desired in that sense. So it's very highly rated on Amazon though. It's got like 4.6. So obviously other people liked it. So you might like it too. I recommend that you go onto different review sites, places like Amazon. He's got a website as well. Read other people's reviews before picking it up. And yeah, just see what you think. I'll be interested to know if you've read it or if you're going to read it. If you've read something else by Jonathan Ward, what you think of his work. Do leave a comment, write to me, let me know.